Hi, everybody. Welcome to the latest episode of Vox Vomitus. I am your host, Jennifer Ann Gordon, the author of the award-winning novel Beautiful, Frightening, and Silent, as well as the Hotel series and Pretty Ugly. With me, as always, is my Vox Vomitus vixen, Allison Martine, author of the Bourbon books. Cheers, Allison. Today, we are joined with Carter Wilson, who has written 7 books, I believe, but he is here talking about his latest, The Dead Husband. Welcome, Carter.
Thanks for having me on your show.
Thanks for being on our show. Can you tell our audience a little bit about yourself and a little bit about The Dead Husband?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I've written 7 books. I tend to write psychological thrillers, standalone thrillers. I kind of gravitate towards the dark and the creepy and the paranoid and the uncertain and the emotional. And the dead, and I never know what I'm doing. So The Dead Husband, the idea behind The Dead Husband was just an opening scene. And I pictured this woman coming back to her family home because her husband had suddenly died and she's with her kid. And she's standing in front of this big imposing door of this mansion in which she grew up. And that's all I saw. That's all I knew. And I didn't know who she was. I didn't know what happened to the husband. I didn't know anything or why she was so trepidatious about coming home. And that's how I write books. I just start with that opening scene. I spend the rest of the book trying to kind of figure out what that opening scene means.
I love that.
So it's about her coming home.
I'm toasting to trepidatious, but also to not having a clue beyond this one scene, because that's so often where I start, where it's like, we will figure out the rest later. So trepidatious, you go.
Well, that's what makes it fun for me, right? Like it's and that's actually how I started writing, was giving myself a puzzle. So how I write is I give myself a challenge. Like what's the deal here? And every day when I sit down to write, it's a discovery and it's fun. It unfolds and I'm like, oh, that's interesting. And that's the joy of writing to me, really. Like that's the I kind of write for myself, right? So, and if hopefully,
someone has to.
Right, exactly. And if I'm enjoying it, hopefully other people will. But I don't really think about other people. I think about what makes me happy in the moment. And
I love that you describe it as a puzzle, because I will admit, when I started reading The Girl in 2A, or The Dead Girl in 2A, I was not expecting that book at all. I was not expecting any of that, and calling it a puzzle is a perfect way of putting it, because I wouldn't really even know what else to call it. But I know Lori's comment popped up saying that she is a fan of psychological thrillers and horror here, so she is listening and watching, and I think she needs to read the 2 books of yours that I just finished, and we will talk more about those as we go. So,
and I just want to say you are in good company here, because we are total pantsers.
Good.
I always I think probably incorrectly, that mystery writers and thriller writers need to know what's going on, because there's a mystery there. And I'm like, they must know. They must be so much more organized than I am. Like just this lowly horror writer who's just like, I don't know what's happening. Like, so it's refreshing for me to hear that as a thriller writer, you don't know what's happening.
No, never. And what's, I'm more or less known as a thriller writer, domestic suspense, but I will say that The Dead Husband was closer to a mystery, and that poses a challenge for me, because I'm never thinking about like, this has to be solved. I'm very happy like getting to the end, like, I don't know, and nobody will know, and that's it.
I feel like because this book described the ending of every book I've written. Like, I don't know what that is. And people are like, well, what did the ending mean? And I'm like, what do you think it meant?
Right.
I'm like, yeah, that could have meant
totally.
That could be right.
And so this was never set up as a murder mystery, but it's kind of packaged a little bit as a murder mystery. But to me, that's not the important part. It's just kind of the emotional journey and what happens to these people. And, that's what's interesting to me. So.
Well, and my first question, I really just wanted to know who comes up with your titles, because there's a lot of dead people in your titles.
Mm-hmm.
And here's the thing. When I picked up both of the books, neither one were what I thought based on the title, both having a dead person in the title. I told Jen, I'm like, by the way, 2A is not an apartment number. It's an airplane seat. And I didn't look at the thumbnail. There's an airplane right on there. My eyes aren't that great either. So it's like, when it's this big, you don't see there's an airplane there.
I've been calling it The Dead Girl in Apartment 2A to myself
the title
for like a week.
No.
In my head. And I'm like, Oh, no.
So the publisher does that. Both of those titles were changed from my original working title because it goes through kind of an analysis and they look at what's in the market that's similar. And the same with the covers, the fonts, the colors, that kind of a thing. So
It's a
yeah,
great
and there's
cover.
yeah,
It's a
I
great
love
cover.
it. Yeah. So, but yeah, it's not really a mystery about a dead husband, but that's kind of what gravitated towards the marketing of it all.
And what's funny is the title that I thought, and this might have even been one of your working titles, I would have wanted it to be the Bury Sisters or the Sisters of Bury. And I wouldn't have been pronouncing it right, but that would have been the cover. I would have been like, ooh, the Bury Sisters, Sisters of Bury. I don't even know what that means, but I want to know.
Yeah, well, that's interesting you say it because my original working title, which I know is always going to change, was Sisters of Bury. And so you know,
in there.
Circle gets a square.
Thank you.
But actually my editor was like not crazy about being kind of cheeky with the name of the town in the title. I mean, because I also had like, you know, What We Bury, but Alan Eskins has a book called that. So
and
anyway.
Shared titles can be kind of a pain in the butt because I have a friend who's she's not even yet on submission, and two of the titles that she and her agent have come up with, we just keep seeing other books announced with those titles. She's like, damn it, that one too.
Yeah, it's a challenge.
I'm working on a book that I came up with the title first and then a concept after as a joke. It was a joke title, but then I'm like, oh, that could kind of work. So then my agent was like, don't tell anybody this title. The title's perfect. Just write a book based on that title. And I'm like,
look, it worked for Neil Gaiman's American Gods. It can work for you too.
Yeah.
Although I don't think his
next
was a joke.
Neil Gaiman.
I don't think his was a joke to one of his writing partners where the writing partner goes, no, Jen, that's good.
I know. And that's what happened.
That's what happened.
Stupid idea.
But you told
Allison.
me.
I know. I'm like, I think if I just wrote a book called blah, 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 it would be a huge hit. And then Allison was just like, can you tell me more about what that book would be? And I'm like,
I think you need to read that book. Well, and I was going to say, so Dead Girl in Two-Way, I'm going to mangle that title too. I'm trying not to. How close were you to calling it The Responsibility of Death? Because I really needed that book.
That's a cool book, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is a cool book. It's a cool book a couple times over.
I don't actually remember what that original working title though was for that. I think The Orphan List was actually.
Oh, that's a great title.
That would work. That would work too, but that might give away more than something as vague and kind of ominous as The Responsibility of Death. And I have intentionally not told Jen almost anything about the book. And she likes spoilers, but I've said very little about it. But I was reading that while she was reading Dead Husband, and we figured, okay, between the two of us, we will have read some of your most recent work. And then I ended up binging Dead Husband this morning. So,
well, I'll say that 2A was a real challenge in what we were talking about earlier in terms of pantsing, because I didn't know what the hell. I wrote 100 pages of like, I don't know how any of this ties together. And that was a real challenging book for me. But actually, when I wrote The Dead Husband, it was almost an antidote to that. It was like, I want to write something more straightforward, more almost personal. But so they're very different stories. One's much more complex, and the other one I think is more probably emotional.
I can see that. And I was telling Jen, I'm glad I read the other one first, simply because I feel like I have a better, broader sense of who you are. And since I don't think either title is what I would have wanted to put these books in, just because I feel like, I want to have these kind of crazy titles that are off the wall. But I understand that's not necessarily what your editors want, because they want to sell.
They want to sell the books.
They want to have big dollar signs. But I liked that idea, and I don't think I would have gotten quite the picture of just your range just from those last two books.
Yeah, and I think that's something that I love about my writing and I hate about my writing is that.
No, you're not allowed to hate that. I'm choosing to your range right there.
Thank you. I think I'm hard to, I think it's hard to say, oh, that's a very prototypical Carter Wilson book. And I love that, right? Because I like to just broaden my horizons with everything that I write. But it makes me, I think, a challenge to market. I think.
I was going to say, that's all on your publicist now. It's all on your marketing team.
And they do a great job. But I think, like you said, like I went into this book thinking it was going to be about a dead girl in an apartment, and it's not that at all. And I see the reviews that say that, and it makes me wonder like about titles and stuff like that. But these publishers know what they're doing. So but it's always an interesting conversation for sure. I love the business side of it all. It's fascinating to me.
God, you're the first author I think we've had on the show that has said, I love the business side of this. That's why I was just like, what?
And I'm not saying that, right. And you can certainly begrudge sales and I wish I were bigger or this and that, but I'm fascinated by the mechanisms of the industry because I'm very business minded. That's my background. And when I started writing, I'm like, I have to learn this entire industry. I have to understand how it all works. And it's very opaque and I'm still learning a lot. But to me, it's just fascinating because there's a lot of aspects that are just instinct. And then they try to kind of, how do I take my instinct and capitalize on that or formalize that? And you can't, but you can do some things. And I'm with Sourcebooks, who's very data driven, which I highly respect. So it's, they really look at what the market is doing. So I love all that stuff.
I'm always intrigued. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, I'm always intrigued with the industry because they really have to be like fortune tellers. They have to figure out what's going to be hot 2 years from now and what will be past its prime 2 years from now. Like the agents and the editors, they're just like, they're thinking so long game that it's
crazy. Or accepting the fact that they'll never know and knowing how to pivot deftly, once all of a sudden, some book out of the blue will hit and they'll be like, oh, is this trend worthy or is it just a one of a kind of a thing? And how do we,
and they scramble.
Yeah. And as an author, the last thing you ever want to do ever is chase a trend. Cause you're going to, by the time you finish the book and by the time it comes out, it'll be 3 years past whatever that trend was. And it might not even be a thing anymore. And people do that and it's a shame. I wish authors would just write what they loved and stuck with that because I think that's more genuine as a product.
Oh. It's totally more genuine, but the number of authors who then get told, well, what the market wants right now is not what you're writing, and that there's absolutely nothing wrong with what they're writing, but it's just not what the market wants. You can't blame them for wanting to chase those trends because they're going, I am doing my best product and I'm getting what they call the champagne rejections.
Yeah.
And they're going, okay, so I have to write to market because if I don't, then I'm never going to get to that point where I can be even part of a trend.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's no question that it's terribly difficult to get published, like no matter how good you are. But I think the industry isn't siloed enough where if you're a solid writer, probably more than a solid writer, if you're an exceptional writer, your work will get noticed by somebody. And that's the other thing is like I've learned over the years is you want an editor and a publisher who really is passionate about your work, not like, okay, that kind of fits the mold because you're not going to get any attention upon, release. So you want somebody who really champions your work. And sure, I mean, I've known a lot of rejection. My first 3 books never sold.
Sorry. Diane Brenner is telling us, oh no, things aren't looking good for my Twilight fanfic. And you're about around. 10 years behind.
That'll come back around.
Yeah, it'll be retro.
It'll be retro. And just like everything right now is like, and then you had a hint of that in Dead Husband. Like there's like this 90s nostalgia that is very hot right now, which I honestly love because and that's when I was a teenager.
And that's a personal choice for sure. Because like right now, what I'm working on that won't come out till whenever 2023 takes place in 1987, not because I'm interested in not because that's a hot thing to do, but I'm like just personally nostalgic because that's when I was 17 years old. And, and I'm like, well, what's this world like without cell phones, without access to information? Mm-hmm. But I love that stuff. I love going back in time. And, even with The Dead Husband, I had to end up predating a couple of years because the book that comes out next year is actually a companion book to Dead Husband, and it takes place in 2020 or was going to take place in 2020. I'm like, oh, I can't do that anymore.
Gosh.
So
2020 doesn't even exist anymore.
Yeah. So I
blurry
this
calendar year.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love when things are like backtracked to the 90s because it allows things to still be very contemporary, but it takes away cell phones and instant access to information. And I think as an author, that's so much easier to write in if we're not constantly thinking, well, they could just text somebody and find out if they were dead or,
and it certainly ups
Facebook.
The stakes, right?
Yeah.
Like you're out by a lake at night and something's going on. You have no ability to call for help,
It cracks me up. I'm remembering a scene from the show Angel where they're down in a sewer and he's just like, this never works. And it's just like for the rest of the series, we never have to deal with cell phones because well, you're in the sewer. You don't get reception there. And you don't way out in the sticks. You don't in the boonies and you don't in the 90s. So if you can just kind of remove those, we don't need them.
And I'll say you set some of your books in New Hampshire and we have terrible cell service here. So you could write that in.
Good to know.
Yeah, good to know. Like there's a 90% chance that we live, like whoever your characters are, live in the woods with terrible cell service.
Yeah,
so.
yeah.
Well, I love that you're writing a companion book to The Dead Husband, and I will not speculate because I want people to read The Dead Husband, so I won't speculate where that's going. I was hoping your next book was actually going to be a puzzle book explaining the publishing industry because it seems like you've got a good handle on it, and you like puzzles, so...
That's a book that's far from being written by me. There's a lot of learning left to do on my end.
So your writing process, you're a pantser. Do you find that, do you vomit words out? Like, do you just like go for it? Or are you like crafting your sentences as you're writing? Like,
yeah, it depends on the scene, right? Like, and it's like every job, right? Some days your job just sucks and you're sitting there and it's data entry and it feels like you're vomiting words just to get to your daily word count or whatever your goal is. And other days, like I'm really connected and I don't know if I'm being necessarily careful about my word choice, but I listen for the lyricism of it. If there's a particular, especially if it's a particularly difficult scene to write, like it needs to have some kind of harmony to me. There needs to be a cadence that I'm feeling it and it has some kind of pull to me. That's when I feel like things are kind of firing on all cylinders for me. But yeah, others days it's just like, oh, I know I'm going to cut all of this, but let me just get something down.
I'm just curious what kind of day it was when you wrote the sentence, "The past is a whore," because I had to actually write that down to not forget it. I actually copied that and went, I need to ask about that sentence. And it goes on beyond that. And the person had a point, but I just was like,
yeah, I have no recollection of writing that sentence. I remember that sentence.
What's funny is I read that and I'm like, oh, I really want to get a tattoo that says that.
Yeah, the whole sentence is, the past is a whore. The present is your mistress. The future is your only true love. And how could you just, the whole tattoo right there, Jen, right there.
Yeah.
Well, Cardi, you put something under your sleeve, but I don't think that's what that is.
No, I've got Kill Your Darlings over here.
Yes.
On an inkwell with a skull. And I have, actually, this says, "And I think how lucky am I?" And it's the penultimate line of a book of mine that was never published. And it's just, I love the scene of, this guy's dying basically, and he's appreciating his life at the end of it. So those are the words on my arms.
Oh, I love that. You also had another phrase that I just absolutely adored, and it was, "Their family tree was made of petrified wood."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that just made that was a rough family. That's a family that's got a lot of issues, and
I was picturing Patrick Stewart as Logan.
Were you really?
Yes.
I was not picturing. Wow, that was not who I pictured.
Yeah.
I pictured more of a barrel of a man than Patrick Stewart ever would be, and even
I just saw like
his
the
roughest
eyes and
but I guess I just will never not have a fondness for Patrick Stewart.
Oh,
so I could never cast him that way. I would just be like, no, Captain Picard, Earl Grey, hot. This isn't gonna.
Still hot, but I was like, play against type, Patrick. Wear that suit.
You wear that suit.
Well, when it becomes a movie, which it surely will, then we can get into that conversation.
We'll do the dream casting later.
We'll do the dream casting.
Especially because since who knows when that would happen, you would want someone who would be an older actor. Some of them might die between now and then. So let's.
Oh, I might die between now and then.
No, don't do that. No, you will not.
You will not. You're young and vital.
I'm not that young.
Teenagers in the 80s and 90s. We're at our prime. So you said earlier, I mean, everybody knows that we're drinking cocktails right now. Mm-hmm. Cheers. And you said normally this is right when I start to write. So you're a nighttime writer or an evening writer?
Evening writer, yeah. I mean, I only write about an hour a day. And I write usually between like 5 and 6. And, everything I do is goal driven, right? So if you make everything goal driven, then you don't have to do a lot at once. And so if I write 500 words a day, 7 days a week, or, the editing equivalent of that, I can get a book done in 10 months, assuming I know what the hell it's going to be about, which is the big,
that's a big assumption right there. But
yeah. But if were I to have a solid idea about where the book is going, the writing part is, I built that muscle. It's pretty easy. So I don't need a lot of time to do it every day. What's problematic is if you fall behind on that and all of a sudden I've got to write 3,000 words today, that's exhausting for me. And I think I don't think I service the book very well when I try to just produce a lot, because I think then it's just like a lot of the words suck.
I get that.
We've talked to different people and everyone has a different approach.
Oh, for sure.
And I know one of the things that's hard for me is that I know I need to be in a certain zone to write. Otherwise, I can have the document open and it will be like, look, I am typing keys, but nothing is actually happening. And anything that does happen will need to be removed later anyway. And not everything that people do, like I know people will say, well, okay, if you're digging ditches, whether you feel like digging ditches or not, you just get out there and dig ditches. But the ditch doesn't care because the ditch is just a ditch. And I can do dishes. I don't dig ditches, but I do dishes whether I feel like it or not. But if I don't feel like writing, anything I come up with is just not so great. So for you, are you a dig ditcher? A dig ditcher? I can't.
Well, so what happens to me is I don't think about my book almost ever until I sit down and write every day. So it's not in my mind. Very rarely is it, thinking about it. So yeah, there are those days when I'm like maybe working on a house project or whatever that I'm really into that I don't want to stop and write, but I do. And I'm like, in my mind, I'm like, this is not going to go anywhere because my mind is elsewhere. But I hold myself up in a little room and I have my headphones on. I'm listening to thunderstorms and I start rereading the last few paragraphs. And I might sit there for 15 minutes and do nothing. And then kind of, the seeds start to grow. And it might be those last 15 minutes of that hour that I write 500 words. And other times, the other thing I do is I try to stop writing when I'm really excited about what's coming next. That's important to me. That doesn't always happen, but that's fun because I can't. This dude's going to die and I can't wait to write that because he might be only one person who's dying in the whole book. I can't wait because there's a whole book that I'm like, I don't know what this book is about, but I know this is going to happen at some point and I can't wait to write that. I got to just figure out how I get to that point.
Oh my gosh. You just described the exact process I'm going through with my current work in progress.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I know what's going to happen and I can't wait to write it. I haven't figured out how I'm getting there yet. So I started writing another book. And then I'm like, what am I doing now?
Yeah, that I can't do. I'm very linear in terms.
I've never
one
done
project
that
at a
before.
time. Oh yeah,
And
that
I'm
would be
just
hard
like,
for me.
What am I doing? So then I know I have to be, spending some time figuring out how to get to the really cool part in my book.
And what I love is being organic about it, and which is almost inevitable if you're a pantser. But people spend their lives in chaos and indecisiveness and the unknown, and that's how I write. Like my characters, who knows what's going to happen next? I have an idea, but it might not be. And because that's how people exist in the world, and I think it makes them more relatable. But it's a lot more fun for me to, my process is I'm constantly asking myself, what if? I might get to a point I'm like, what if I just killed this person? What would happen? Like, and I've done that before. I've killed off major characters on a complete whim and just written the scene and like, okay, now what? And then you start to realize like, oh, that makes it a lot more interesting. Or maybe you scrap it. Who knows? But
resuscitate, bring him back.
Right.
My gosh. I feel
Just
like I'm
that-
going to start doing that in like every book. Just like anytime I
That
get
freewheeling
blocked,
is so much fun.
I'm going to kill one person in this scene and then figure out what happens.
Right.
So, okay, the follow-up question then is, if you're freewheeling it and you get to the end, do you ever get there and go, okay, this didn't work? Or do you pretty much immediately know afterwards, if you chew the what if card and you go down a path that was not the right path, are you pretty quick to figure out this was not the alley I should have stumbled down drunk?
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, it'll be rare that I finish a book and feel like I just veered in the wrong direction halfway through. But, I've had scenes where, and that's what, your readers, your beta readers are for, and your agents for, and your editors is for. They'll say like, I need the great example is The Dead Husband. The original ending went on for about another 20 pages. And my editor said,
this is why there's a follow-up book. Like,
my editor said, like, I think this is the emotional ending of this book.
Mm-hmm.
And like, oh, I didn't have the perspective, having been inside this book for so long, to know that. And it's so great to get that feedback and to really chew on that and be like, oh yeah, I think you're right. So yeah, I've definitely, but I think every story of mine could have a multitude of endings. Many of which would work, many of which wouldn't. And this just happens to be the one that I wrote. So I kind of,
that's the one we got.
That's the one we like.
That's how you
choose your own adventure novel.
That's right.
I'd read that.
I would read it.
But you'll constantly beat yourself up for being like, oh yeah, that would have been a better ending. So no, just this is what you wrote, and it could have been a million different things. And you just kind of accept it and then you let it go.
Well, and I know from my debut novel, I struck the epilogue because I decided there was going to be another book. So I've been there and I get that.
Wow.
And, oh, you know what? These couple paragraphs, we don't need them. Let's add 90,000 more words.
Yeah.
Oh,
why not?
Yeah, that's not me.
Completely different book. And that sometimes that works. And sometimes, again, with that emotional resonance, like, where do you want to leave the reader when they're done? And is that a good place? And will that make somebody hopefully pick up the next book, whether it's related to it or just going another book by that author?
Yeah, and I know a lot of times I have very ambiguous endings, which I'm personally a fan of, but they're not maybe ambiguous to me. But I'll know if I'm writing the ending and I actually feel emotional, like almost getting like choked up writing. I'm like, this is the ending. This is how it ends. And it might not be right, but I'm feeling this right now, and that's important for me to experience. And again, selfishly, I'm not thinking of anyone else but me as I'm writing it, because the story is for me, and then hopefully it will resonate and certainly get better crafted and honed with other advice from agents and editors. But if it doesn't make me happy, then I don't know what I'm doing.
So you've written 7 novels. You said your first 3 weren't published?
Correct.
And I think you're roughly in our age range.
I'm 51. I just turned 51.
Well, you look good.
I'm counting that roughly in my age range. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm like, we're in our 40s.
Got it.
Women in our 40s. So I have to ask, like, what did you do before you became Carter Wilson, USA Today bestselling author?
I still have another job. So I went to hotel school, and I've been in the hospitality industry for decades. And I'm a consultant, basically. So I do a lot of lecturing on the state of the hotel industry. So a lot of public speaking and that kind of thing. And I love it because it's a wonderful industry. Hotels are amazing. I'm a huge hotel snob. So I have learned, how do I write novels and, have a job that gives me health insurance and all the other stuff.
Yeah.
So I've worked very hard to make sure, like, the consistency is the key, right? So that's why I said, like, maybe it's only 45 minutes or an hour a day, but if you do it every day, you'll get it done.
Like now I have to ask, I love traveling. Like pre-COVID, I was travel bug, travel snob. Can't wait to be traveling again. What is the best hotel you've ever stayed in, and where?
Ever.
Ever.
It probably, and this was also just because of I was with my partner, and we went to Africa, South Africa, and we stayed at the Leopard Mountain Lodge, which is all of maybe 10 rooms out in the middle of just the wilderness, and where they escort you back to your room at night because of lions.
Yeah,
like don't walk alone kind of a thing. And we had an amazing, and it's just a super luxury, beautiful canopied room. And
oh my gosh, I miss traveling.
Yeah, I know.
Keep talking about that card. I just say it like slower.
Travel porn.
It is like travel porn. Can you tell me about the seats?
Well, and I'm laughing because there are scenes of both hotels, and then even almost, I wouldn't say it's an extraneous reference to a bed and breakfast in Dead Husband. And I was just going, I don't have any port. Now I kind of want to have port, because the only time I've ever seen port in real life is at a bed and breakfast.
That's funny.
Bed and breakfasts are required to have port, but I don't know. Are bed and breakfasts considered part of the hospitality industry because they're often independently owned?
I will tell you that reference to the bed and breakfast was because when I was researching Mr. Tinder's Girl, which I said in Manchester, I stayed at the Ash Street Inn, which is a lovely B&B.
Oh my gosh.
Have you been there?
I know it.
Yeah.
I was honestly thinking, I'm like, what bed and breakfast is this? So everybody, part of the Dead Husband takes place in New Hampshire, which longtime viewers know that's where I live. Carter has said another book there as well. So I spent so much time trying to figure out where everything was. And at first I thought, I'm like, oh, I feel like he's writing about the BVI, the Bedford Village Inn. But then I'm like, no, it's a bed and breakfast. That's too big.
Yeah. No, I became friends with the proprietors there, who are lovely people, and it's a wonderful place.
And they made it into your book. I love it.
Yeah. So
I
wanted
wanted
it was definitely
to stay
based on
there.
that.
So now I just feel like I could do a staycation.
Yep, totally. That's a great place.
Well, and that's sometimes what bed and breakfasts are best for, because maybe you can only afford a night or two, because they're usually a lot more expensive than comparable things, because you're getting fed and there's company and you can't put a price tag on love. But that's still, right. It's not necessarily that you go for like a family vacation. Yeah, it's usually bigger for like 3 or 4 nights, but a perfect staycation. I know I don't know if you've ever been to the Doryman out in Newport out here, but gorgeous. Probably the nicest room I've ever stayed in, and it was something that was gifted. There was no way that I was ever affording. I was back in law school at the time. I had no money. So, but again, bed and breakfasts, lovely things.
Bed and breakfasts.
I love to travel. I try to get out of the country once a year. I mean, last year I didn't, obviously, but and this year unfortunately I won't. But normally once or twice a year I'm in some other country, and I just love it.
Yeah, my husband and I, he's Russian. And his family had always their dream for his whole life was they wanted him to go into the hotel industry. He didn't. He became a professional ballroom dancer.
He didn't.
As I did.
Two totally separate things.
Drastically different way of life.
Both involve ballrooms.
Ballrooms.
That's really the only commonality I'm coming up with.
But we try pre-COVID. We would do someplace out of the country once a year, someplace in the country once a year, sometimes more than that, if we could figure it out.
Well, it just expands your worldview, right? And all of that, getting back to the subject of writing, that all kind of feeds into it. Like, you have just an appreciation and a greater degree of empathy as a human, the more time you spend on the road, for sure. Despite all the frustrations and whatever, you see different points of view. And that is I think empathy is probably the most important tool that an author can have. And if you don't have it naturally, I honestly don't think you're going to be a great writer.
No,
I think you have to really have empathy to be first person, present tense, opposite sex point of view. Like, how do you do that unless you have some degree of empathy and understand, like, the human condition?
Says the man who wrote A Wonderful Leading Lady. And I want to actually, I'm putting that out only because about 3/4 of the way through, it occurred to me, I can't remember the last time I read a main character that was the opposite sex of the author so well that I forgot that it wasn't the same. Because usually you see women write women. I mean, sometimes it's both. So I know in Dead Girl and Two-Way, you have one of each. But having it be primarily female-led, not that there weren't male main characters in Dead Husband as well, but the emotional core is really Rose. So you did her so well.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I
You're
first
not gonna
started
see
doing that
yourself
with my
Yeah,
third book. You know, I started getting the feedback. Like what I always hated was when somebody would say, somebody who I know would say, like, "Oh man, I could totally see you in this character. It totally sounded like you," and that drove me crazy because I didn't want that.
Yeah.
And so with my third book, I wrote it from a female perspective, and I fell in love with it. I just loved and it wasn't. This is going to sound usually pretentious, but it wasn't a huge challenge because what I tried not to do was overthink it. You know, I try not to think, what would a woman do? What would a man do?
I know, like we're just people. We're still human people.
What does a person do who's faced with this pretty horrible situation? How does this human being react? And I'm not saying there aren't differences, but generally speaking, I think it's easy to overthink. And if you don't overthink it, then you can envelop that character. And so, you know, Mr. Tinder's Girl was all first person present tense from a 28-year-old female. And then,
which you have probably never been.
Not recently.
Not recently, not in this lifetime.
Well, and I was going to say, and I apologize, I was trying not to talk over you there. I just wanted to say I'm glad I'm not going to see any snippets from Dead Husband or Dead Girl in those Twitter threads where it's like men writing women badly. Because I've seen those a lot. And the only reason I was even bringing it up was because I have seen that, and I have seen someone try to step out of their comfort zone and they leave that empathy behind. They leave that humanity behind. You never did that. So,
well, thank you. And for sure, you're never, as you both know, I'm sure you're never going to please everybody. And
No.
you know, if you please 65%, you're doing a pretty good job.
That's really good.
So there are definitely people who are, you know, you'll get feedback that, you know, oh, this wasn't believable, this and that. But, you know, it's rare. I don't get so much of that in terms of the voice. You know, I'll get more like the plot was unbelievable or whatever it is.
Well,
I'm like, yeah,
I mean,
totally. But it was fun as hell.
Hopefully it should be.
You're like, really? I hope this didn't happen.
Yeah.
Right.
Next, you're gonna tell me Dead Girl is autobiographical.
I loved that you wrote from a female point of view. I have written a few books from the male point of view, and again from a very human experience. I didn't write about the male experience, air quotes. I just wrote from a male's point of view, and I found it like really freeing.
Yeah.
But then
Totally.
I remember when I first started doing interviews, I would have people ask me the question like what made you think you could write from a male's point of view? Like, did you do research?
My imagination.
I'm like, my imagination. I was like,
I'm
nothing.
just trying to picture the research.
What research? How does like?
I stalked a man for a day just to see what it was like.
Yeah,
to wear his
just like what does he do?
I kept him in my basement.
Yeah.
I kidnapped a man. He's still there now.
You guys are married now. It's a very sweet story.
I was gonna say, and now we're married.
Now we're married.
And that is my
Wave
husband.
a dog.
His name is Roman.
Yeah.
Well, if you read a book, or in my case, a lot of times I'll watch a show, a streaming show, and I'll be like, why is this person so fascinating? What is it about this person that, you know, regardless of their gender, and you absorb that stuff? Same thing when you're reading, like, you know, you're just like, why is this protagonist so interesting? And if you can absorb that, and again, going back to the empathy, kind of be able to live in their shoes a little bit, it's not terribly hard. But, you know, then my agent's a woman and my editor's a woman. So I have, and my partner's a woman who is the first one who reads my completed manuscript. So I have no shortages of great sources of feedback.
Female Eye is going to be on there, so they're not going to let you get away with something where we go, that's not how that works. Anatomically, that's impossible. Start over.
I know. I feel like a lot of those men writing women badly things involve like the romance genre a lot. Like
see, I wouldn't do that.
You're like, that's not how our body works.
I very rarely write sex scenes. I sex, violence, profanity, all of that. I love all of it, right? It all has to be treated
The trifecta.
delicately and with respect, and it has to serve the story. And so, you know, when it happens, it has to have meaning and it has to be impactful. And because maybe you don't do it a lot, when it does happen, you're like, oh, this is something. And so, yeah, it's very rare that I certainly sex scenes. I mean, I've done a few, but they were hugely important to the story. It wasn't just like, oh, I need these characters to fall in love. Like, no, they need to have sex because this has major consequences if they do. That's important. So, and it's totally the same with violence. Like, gratuitous violence is the most boring thing I can think of. So, when it happens, and I want it to be real. So, you get shot in the leg, you're not running away. You get punched in the face, you're not thinking straight. So it's very important that it's accurate.
I don't want to say spoilery things, but there are a couple violent moments in The Dead Husband. And I loved the way you handled not only, I'd say weirdly, the awkwardness of violence, of a,
that's a good way of putting it.
Because it's not a film where everything is choreographed and people know what's happening. Half the time,
and you can't just cut away. There's something on the floor you got to deal with. There's a reality.
Yes. Gosh.
Well, and I was going to say, even when you said the awkwardness, again, I don't want to do a spoiler, but even physiological reactions for other people witnessing something so horrific. And a lot of times we just don't even go there or think about it because, the camera is focused on the person who's bleeding out or got shot or whatever. But that's not something you can just witness and be like, sure, moving on, turn the page.
Right. No, I want it to be uncomfortable. I don't want to dwell on it, but I read a great book once. I think it was called Writing Violence, and it was written by a guy who used to be a prison guard. And he's like, this is what happens when fights happen. This is what happens with adrenaline. And you read that, you're like, oh, that's really fascinating. This is what the human body is capable of withstanding and not withstanding. So it's important to me that that's at least realistic.
Well, and I'm glad he did that research for you, so you didn't have to go through all these things yourself.
Right. That
would not have been pleasant.
As far as you know.
Really write it and have empathy. I need to be shot.
New Hampshire underground fight club. That's really why Carter came to New Hampshire. He just went to a bed and breakfast, but in their basement, he's like, punch me in the face 1,000 times and let me figure out how I'm feeling. That's empathically.
Well, and I was going to go back to empathy, just because empathy is such a big theme in some of your works, and whether people have it or not, and how people might respond to other things around them because of their empathy. And even you say you need it to be a writer. We all need it just to be humans and not sociopaths. So It's good if we have that, and if you can expand on it to write, more power to you.
Right. No, I agree.
But it's also really interesting that there are people who don't have it, because that makes us as writers have characters that we can develop and discover. Oh, that is what a person is without
a soul.
Totally.
An emotional well.
And that was kind of the challenge I ended up posing myself with The Dead Husband, is well, what if you have one of each and they're sisters and they came from the same background and, same genetic pool, but yet they're
although that totally was ambiguous. Disparate. You raised a little bit of a question about some of that.
Yeah, I did.
Maybe that was supposed to be ambiguous.
Yeah, it is a little bit, because I don't know if I know what the answer that is.
That happens. Yeah. We will lose Jen sometimes. She'll be back in half a second. Her phone likes to do this with StreamYard. Doesn't like her phone, so
that's the New Hampshire connection.
It's the New Hampshire. New Hampshire says we've had enough of you, and then see, she comes back. She is back.
You remember what I said about our cell phone service?
Yeah.
There it is. Yep. Right, we're back. But I was just going to say, just the fact that you have these characters who are drawn from the same upbringing and then can be so very different. And I know, like I said, I was reading one book and Jen was reading the other, and she said, you have to see this, at least the beginning. If you can't read the rest, that's fine. She said, because of sisters, because she is an only child. She knows I have a sister. My sister relationship is nothing like the sisters in the book.
Your sister's not a sociopath.
That
For the record.
She's not.
I'm like,
she is not.
You always tell me that I remind you of her.
I know. That's why Jen's very defensive. She's like, your sister's not a sociopath, and neither am I.
Neither am I.
But to have that where you can come from the same background and go, but why are we so different? We went through the same experiences. Wait, did something different happen to you? That kind of thing. And then that ability to look back. And I know my sister and I do that as adults, and go back and talk about things that happened as children with those eyes of adulthood, and then go, okay, how did that shape us? And did we really even have the same upbringing, even in the same house?
Yeah, I mean, definitely a thread throughout my books, and you'll see this with Dead Girl in 2A as well, is like I'm very intrigued by what the quote unquote villain's motivations are. And I don't like the whole idea of villain for villain's sake. You know, that's uninteresting to me. I love the idea that all of us, regardless of what our end result actions are believing we're acting true to our nature. And that's not necessarily a bad thing to us. So that might result in horrific crimes being committed, but I don't like the idea of like I commit crimes because I'm Snidely Whiplash and I'm just inherently evil and it's fun.
Put on the mustache here.
That's not interesting to me. I want somebody who's struggling with maybe they know that it's not right, but they're that's their behavior. I love that struggle. I think struggle is the most important thing in writing to me, is that everyone has to be struggling a lot, and some might overcome it, some may not. So that's what's interesting to me, at least.
I feel like you just said like the anthem to all people who write darker fiction. Allison writes romance, but she also writes speculative literary fiction. So she's a darker one.
I'm not usually that dark.
But I mean, yeah, like the fact that you just said like they have to be struggling all the time, I feel like is like that is how I plan my books. I just come up with an idea and I'm like, how do I make these people suffer and struggle for 90,000 words and then maybe learn something and things happen on the way.
But I'm going to say struggle has to happen in all kinds of fiction or it's boring. So even if you're writing romance, if there's no struggle, if the only struggle is we don't know how to communicate, miscommunication, that is a dull book and I don't want to read it. And I've read that 5 times.
And it's always interesting getting feedback from readers, because I don't set out with any book to say, I'm going to make this, dark and depressing. That's not my intention. My intention is like, I want to find interesting characters and throw some things at them and see how they figure it out. I want to see, because in my mind is like that. What would I do in this situation? I recently had a reader tell me like, are all your books just so sad? And I'm like, oh, I don't see them as sad at all. They're hopeful to me. So everyone's got a different perspective, right? And you might write something that's like, this part's a little bit dark. That might be horrifying to some people, and other people are like, oh, that wasn't much. But to me, it's about the struggle, because I think struggle is interesting. I think tension is interesting. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't mean it has to be, bad, and not, I'm not setting out to just do things to people that make their lives miserable, but I just want to see like, how are you going to get out of this? I think that it's fun for me to see people, use their own brains to puzzle solve their own predicaments.
And also just like emotionally figure out how to wake up the next morning. I feel like that's like, it's such a crazy thing that we as writers can do is, make our characters deal with things that we've never had to deal with, but they have to keep going.
Right. And it's cathartic, right? Because I know there's situations that I write about that I'm like, I would be crippled by this. Yeah. I know I would be. So it's nice to experience like somebody who, isn't a superhero by any means, but figures out like, I need to bring closure to this situation. But in order to do that, I'm going to have to go through some serious shit to do it. And I like to live through them for a little bit to see like, wow, good for you, because I would be a wreck. So it's, I felt
like
important.
that about several of your characters in The Dead Husband. I was like, whoa, at that moment in time, I would have just like drank an entire bottle of vodka and been like, okay,
totally.
Bye.
Totally.
Well, no spoilers. I already told Jen what it was earlier, but there's a scene in Dead Husband where I'm like, that could have happened in my life, because there were enough similarities going like, and thank God it didn't. But it kind of halfway through a shocker scene that, well.
Yeah, and I think I know the scene you're talking about, and that's a good example of like, I didn't know that was going to happen until that day that I was writing that. And it just hit me. I'm like, what if this happened? And I wrote it, and I actually cried. And I'm like, I'm
glad you cried.
I wanted you to feel that.
I'm so mean. I'm glad you cried, Carter.
But it actually was so. After writing that, it unveiled to me like, oh, there's a parallel life here between these two characters that I never saw as clearly until this happened. And now, so it was ultimately important. You kind of hope as a writer, your subconscious is kind of working, overtime, and eventually is going to catch up with what your typing of the words. So,
well, and I told Jen afterwards, I said, I now understand the title, and it isn't what I thought it was, because that's where I understood the title when that happened. I won't say more because I want people to read it, but that's where I got it. And I went, all right, it does make sense. It just doesn't make sense in the way I thought it did in those, the girl peeking behind the door with the bright yellow letters and
right.
What everybody's going, ooh, dead husband. We like dead things. Pick up the book.
And we hate husbands, so
we do.
Let's buy it.
It's when I go and do hashtags and go dead husband, it is a common thing. I think dead husbands are very popular, so very smart to capitalize on that trend.
And I feel like
kudos to my publisher.
Yes.
My poor husband, when he's like, "What are you reading this week?" I'm like, "Dead husband," and he's like, "Oh gosh, should I be worried?" I'm like, "It's not a how-to manual."
It could be.
We want the one I'm publishing, not this one and all the dead people.
I hate to say this, but we are out of time. Carter, you have been fantastic. Thank you for being here and having a cocktail with us.
Well, I love chatting with you guys. It's always fun to talk about writing and the industry and perspectives and empathy. So cheers to empathy.
I know. Thank you for bringing up empathy. Thank you, Allison, of course. Thank you, Roman, our producer. Thank you, Pam Stack, our executive producer. Thank you to everybody at the Global Authors on the Air radio network. I'm going to massacre her name. But next week we have the author of A Low Country Bride, Priscilla's totally massacred it, Williams.
We will get it right by next week.
I'll get it right. I will get it right. So please stay tuned for that. Again, thank you, everybody. This has been a copywritten podcast on the Global Authors on the Air radio network.